Our next topic of discussion really is a landslide of change, I guess we could say. I don't want to be too dramatic, but these are really practice-changing findings that are now in our population of patients with advanced HER2-positive breast cancers. It's got a long natural history, and Ian, maybe you can start off with sort of the key large randomized phase 3 trial data, and then some of the other data that we have that really gives us a lot of hope for really effective new agents.
Yeah, so I mean, I think, so there was one session at San Antonio this year for which, there were 3 data sets for a similar patient population. These are patients with HER2-positive advanced disease who had already, for the most part, progressed on trastuzumab, pertuzumab, and T-DM1. So we're talking third and later line patients for whom, there are treatments, but they're not, the efficacy of those third and later line treatments are not great. There's no standard of care, and probably represents the biggest unmet medical need in metastatic HER2-positive disease right now. And so we had several data sets that I do think are practice changing. So one was the HER2 CLIMB study, a study that randomized patients who had already had T-DM1, pertuzumab, and trastuzumab to either a standard of capecitabine trastuzumab with either placebo or this new HER2 kinase inhibitor, tucatinib. And the interesting thing about tucatinib is, unlike lapatinib and neratinib, it does not block EGFR, so you don't get nearly as much diarrhea and rash as you do with the other TKIs. And tucatinib gets into the brain very well. And so the unique feature of this trial was that for the first time it allows patients not only who have stable brain metastases, but also patients who had progressive brain metastases. And the data that were presented were unequivocally positive. In the primary endpoint of PFS in the entire population, the hazard ratio was 0.54. They even, so I think someone unexpectedly hit their overall survival cutoff for an interim analysis, and the hazard ratio was, I think it was a 36%.
That was like close to 0.5 in some of the
studies. Yeah, it was like 0.6. Well, the survival I think was 0.64, so 36% benefit in that. Which we don't typically see survival benefits so early. And in the patient population who had brain metastases, both treated and untreated, the hazard ratio was 0.48. So, this clearly beneficial. There is added toxicity with tucatinib, but it's pretty mild. There was some increased diarrhea, there was some increased PPE, I think, a little bit, but overall pretty well tolerated and, unequivocal benefit. So I think that is definitely going to become a treatment option for these third and later line patients, particularly those patients in whom brain metastases are a really predominant problem. Another data set that was presented was was focused on a new antibody-drug conjugate called trastuzumab deruxtecan. It differs from T-DM1 in the sense that its payload is a topoisomerase 1 inhibitor, which is not a chemotherapy we typically use in breast cancer, but that may mean that cancers are less resistant to this. And interestingly, this drug has a bystander effect, meaning that the payload, once it goes into a cell, can diffuse out of the cell and hit neighboring cells, which may help with this heterogeneity issue that we talked about.
So remember, that's different from T-DM1, right? That's the big key that people need to know, that T-DM1 does not have that bystander effect.
Correct, correct. So in a patient population that was heavily pretreated, this was a single-arm phase 2 study, 184 patients. All the patients had prior trastuzumab and T-DM1, 2/3 had prior pertuzumab. Stable brain mets were allowed, but not progressive brain mets. This study showed its primary endpoint, objective response, was 60.9%. And the PFS as a median was 16.4 months, which both of those numbers are roughly double or triple what's been seen in historical controls. So this is clearly an effective agent. The toxicity is interesting. In terms of common toxicities, GI and hematologic were what was seen, but they were almost low grade. So that's not an issue really for most patients. What was seen, and this was also seen in the previous trial, was that interstitial lung disease or pneumonitis was present in about 13% of patients. Most of those were low grade and manageable, but 4 patients out of 184 died. So 2% of patients had fatal ILD. So clearly we're going to have to learn how to manage ILD or pneumonitis with the use of this drug, but its efficacy in a very pretreated population, I think, is going to be very welcome for patients who have pretty refractory cancers. Lastly, we heard updated data from my neighbor here on the podium from margetuximab, which is this very interesting, yet a third cool mechanism of action. We had, all three of these drugs had different mechanisms of action. This one is a modified trastuzumab, which is designed to interact better with natural killer cells to improve ADCC and other immune effects. We saw previous PFS data showing an improvement in PFS, which was one of the primary endpoints. There's a modest difference, but statistically significant. And now we saw some increased, some updated overall survival data. It's not yet statistically significant, but trending in the right direction. And what's particularly interesting about this data set was that there are people who have two different kinds of FC receptors based on genetic polymorphisms. One is a high affinity receptor, and the majority of people have low affinity receptors. Based on preclinical data, it's thought that this drug, which binds better to these FC receptors, would have most of its benefit in patients who had the low affinity receptors, which is 86% of patients. And that does seem to be what's borne out in this trial, was that the majority of the benefit was in patients who had these low affinity receptors. Somewhat surprisingly, it actually may look like trastuzumab was actually better than margetuximab in the 15% of patients who had the high affinity receptors, but that could be
There were 69
right,
patients.
69.
They
Yeah,
had
so that could be
three
a
times the number of brain mets, liver mets, lung.
Yeah,
They
low
were really.
end,
So
right.
it could be an artifact
It wasn't
of
the
balanced.
artifact of the
Yeah, it
design,
wasn't balanced.
Right, but clearly in those patients who have the low affinity receptors, this does look like a potentially advantageous drug, and the toxicity is virtually the same as trastuzumab, other than some increased risk of low-grade infusion reactions. So, I think three very interesting drugs, which really should change the landscape of the third and later line cancers. I think we as a community are going to have to figure out how to sequence these drugs. We have to figure out how to manage the pneumonitis that's associated with trastuzumab deruxtecan. But overall, it's a clear win for patients.